What happens when a man hollowed out by grief and hiding from the world stumbles upon a secret hidden in the highest peaks of the Rockies? This isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's the story of Jedediah Stone, a widower who lost everything, and the two silent children he found huddled in the wilderness, speaking a language no one had ever heard. They were orphans, a mystery wrapped in silk and shivering in the American frontier. But they were not forgotten. This is a story of how one man's act of compassion ignited a fire of fear in a town called Redemption, and how that fire drew an impossible delegation from halfway across the world, led by a man of peace, their father, who would have to walk through a wall of rifles to show his gratitude. The grief in Jedediah Stone was a physical thing. It was a cold, hard stone in his gut that had settled there the day he buried his wife Sarah and their infant son Daniel side by side on the unforgiving hill overlooking their homestead. That was 6 months ago in the spring of 1878, when a fever had swept through Redemption Gulch and taken the two halves of his heart with it. Now, in the biting chill of late autumn, the grief was his only constant companion. He'd sold the homestead. The sight of Sarah's rocking chair, forever still, or the empty cradle he'd painstakingly carved, was a torment he could not endure. He took the money, his hawk and rifle, a good mule named Cinder, and retreated into the jagged, indifferent embrace of the Rocky Mountains. He became a ghost, a trapper who kept to the highest lines, a man whose conversations were with the wind and the pines. People in town whispered he'd gone half mad with sorrow. They weren't entirely wrong. It was on a hunt for bighorn sheep high above the timberline, where the air was thin and sharp as a razor, that he found the first sign of something amiss. Tucked into a crevice between two colossal granite boulders was a flash of color that had no place in the muted palette of the mountains, a strip of faded saffron yellow silk snagged on a thorny branch. It was impossibly delicate, woven with a skill he'd never seen. Curiosity, an emotion he thought long dead, flickered within him. He dismounted from Cinder, tying her reins to a skeletal pine, and approached. Behind the boulders was a makeshift shelter, a crude lean-to of fallen branches and pine boughs, but constructed with a desperate, meticulous care. The cold was profound here, shielded from the wind, but sunk in a permanent shadow. A faint, cloying smell hung in the air, a scent Jedediah knew all too well, the smell of death that had lingered too long. His hand went instinctively to the worn stock of his rifle. He peered inside. In the gloom, he saw a figure huddled under a pile of furs and more of that strange, colorful cloth. It was a woman. Her skin was the color of aged parchment, her features delicate and foreign, with high cheekbones, and eyes that even in their stillness were slanted in a way he'd never seen before. She was clearly gone. An overturned water skin lay beside her, and a small, empty leather pouch. There were no signs of violence, no animal attack. It looked as if she had simply lain down in the cold and surrendered. A wave of nausea and a pang of unwanted empathy struck Jedediah. He knew that surrender. He felt it every morning when he woke. He was about to back away to leave the poor woman to her mountain grave when he saw a flicker of movement in the deepest shadows of the lean-to. He froze, raising his rifle. "Who's in there?" He called out, his voice a rusty croak. Silence. Then a tiny whimper. Slowly, his eyes adjusted. It wasn't one shadow, but two. Two small children huddled together, their faces pale with terror and cold. They were no older than 5 or 6, a boy and a girl, their features a perfect miniature echo of the dead woman's. They were dressed in layers of the same strange quilted fabrics, their black hair cut in straight, severe lines across their foreheads. They stared at him with eyes as dark and vast as the night sky eyes that held a terror so profound it seemed ancient. The girl, bolder of the two, let out a string of soft, melodic syllables that were utterly alien to his ears. It wasn't Spanish, not any native tongue he'd ever heard on the plains. It was like the chiming of tiny, unfamiliar bells. The boy simply watched him, his gaze unnervingly intelligent, his small body rigid with fear. In his hand, he clutched a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Jedediah lowered his rifle, his heart, that useless hardened organ, giving a painful lurch. He thought of Daniel, of the tiny hand that used to curl around his finger. The stone of grief in his gut seemed to shift, to grind against his ribs. "Easy now," he said softly, holding up an empty hand. "I'm not going to hurt you." They didn't understand his words, but they understood the change in his tone. The girl stopped her chiming pleas and watched him, her head tilted. He knew what he had to do. The thought was a burden. He didn't want a complication to his carefully curated emptiness. He couldn't leave them here. They'd be dead by morning. The mountain would take them just as it had taken their mother. And for reasons he couldn't articulate, that was a fate he suddenly could not abide. The burial was a grim, silent affair. He used his hands and a flat rock to dig a shallow grave in the frozen earth, piling stones high to keep the scavengers away. The children watched their faces impassive, a stillness in their grief that was more unnerving than tears. As he placed the last rock, the little girl began to chant a low, humming melody that vibrated through the cold air. The boy joined, in his voice a fragile harmony. It was a funeral rite, a farewell, in a language the mountains had never known. Getting them to come with him was another matter. They shrank back when he approached. He retreated, unstrapped a piece of hardtack and a strip of jerky from his saddlebag, and set it on a rock between them. He backed away and sat waiting. For an hour, they didn't move. Then cautiously, the girl crept forward, snatched the food, and scurried back to her brother, where they shared the meager offering in tiny, deliberate bites. Patience. It was the trapper's greatest virtue. He sat until the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long, menacing shadows. The temperature plummeted. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. He stood up slowly, walked to his mule, and began preparing a space for them on Cinder's back, a nest of blankets and furs. He worked without looking at them, a silent invitation. When he was done, he turned. The boy stood his ground, but the girl, shivering violently now, took a hesitant step forward, then another. She looked from Jedediah to the makeshift grave, then back. Her small face was a mask of conflict, fear of the stranger, fear of the encroaching night. Finally, she walked to him, her small hand outstretched, not to take his, but to touch the rough wool of his coat, as if testing to see if he was real. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's all right," he murmured. "Time to go." He lifted her body, weighing almost nothing, and settled her onto the mule. She didn't fight. He turned to the boy, who still clutched his wooden bird. The boy looked at his sister, safe for the moment, in her nest of wool, and then at Jedediah, with a quiet, resigned dignity that was heartbreaking in one so young. He walked forward and allowed Jedediah to lift him up beside his twin. As they began the slow, treacherous descent down the mountain, Jedediah Stone, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, led a mule carrying two silent orphaned children from a land he couldn't name. He was heading back towards Redemption Gulch, a place he had fled. He didn't know what he would do with them. He only knew that the silence behind him was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of a woman's grave and the echo of a song he did not understand. The stone in his gut was still there, but now it felt a little less like grief and a little more like a responsibility he was terrified to carry. Redemption Gulch was a town that clung to the edge of civilization by its fingernails. It consisted of one dusty main street, a dozen wooden-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, and the sheriff's office. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and anything out of the ordinary was treated with suspicion first and hostility second. Jedediah Stone's return was in itself an event. Riding in from the high country with his beard grown wild and his eyes haunted was one thing, but riding in with two strange, dark-eyed children perched on his mule was another thing entirely. It was a spectacle. Windows rattled as curtains were pulled aside. Men stopped mid-conversation, their mouths agape. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the boarding house and the town's primary dispatcher of gossip, stood on her porch with a hand to her chest, as if she'd seen a two-headed calf. Jedediah ignored them all. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face a granite mask. The twins, nestled in their cocoon of blankets, looked out at the strange, loud world with wide, unblinking eyes. The girl Pimmer, as he'd started to think of her, pointed a tiny finger at a dog barking in the street, a flicker of curiosity in her expression. The boy Norbu simply tightened his grip on his wooden bird and pressed closer to his sister. Jedediah's first and only stop was the office of Dr. Elias Vance. Doc Vance was a man out of place in Redemption Gulch. He was from Boston, well-read and soft-spoken, with a mind as sharp as his surgical tools. He had come west for his wife's health years ago. She had passed, but he had stayed a lonely beacon of science and reason in a sea of superstition. He was perhaps the only man in town Jedediah considered a friend. He pushed open the door to the small clinic. The air inside smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Elias looked up from a medical journal, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. His eyes widened when he saw Jedediah, and then wider still when he saw the children. "Good Lord, Jed," he breathed, standing up. "What in heaven's name?" "Found them," Jedediah said, his voice raw. "Up on the widow's peak. Their mother, she didn't make it." He gently lifted the children down from the mule. Inside the warmer room, their weariness became apparent. They swayed on their feet, their faces etched with exhaustion. Elias knelt, his movements calm and reassuring. "Easy, little ones," he murmured, more to himself than to them. He tried to check them for fever, but Pimmer flinched away, letting out a sharp, bird-like cry. Norbu instantly put himself in front of her, a tiny, fierce protector. "They don't speak English," Jedediah explained, "or anything else I know." Elias nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Their features, the epicanthic fold. It's Asian, Chinese perhaps. We've had a few work crews for the railroad pass through the territory, but never this far up, and never with women and children." He looked at their layered clothing, the strange, vibrant patterns. "This is different. This is not the garb of a laborer." He managed to coax them into sitting, giving them a small cup of sweetened, lukewarm tea, which they drank with a delicate, surprising formality. He examined them from a distance, noting their thinness, the chapped skin on their faces, but no obvious signs of the fever or other common ailments. They were malnourished and exhausted, but they were survivors. The clinic door creaked open. Sheriff Brody stood, silhouetted in the doorway, his large frame blocking out the light. Brody was a man who saw the world in black and white, lawful and unlawful, safe and dangerous. He was a former lawman from the Kansas cattle towns, and he ran Redemption Gulch with a firm, unyielding hand. "Jedediah," he said, his voice flat. He didn't sound pleased to see him. His eyes flicked to the children, and his face hardened. "What's this herd you rode in with a couple of strays?" "They're not strays, Brody." Jedediah snapped, his protective instincts flaring. "They're children. I found them orphaned." "Orphaned how?" Brody stepped inside, his spurs ringing on the wooden floor. He looked the twins up and down as if they were livestock. "Where are they from? They don't look like they're from around here." "Does it matter?" Doc Vance interjected smoothly, stepping between the sheriff and the children. "They are here now, Sheriff, and they are in need of care." Brody grunted, unconvinced. "It matters. We don't know anything about them. Could be carrying sickness. Could be their people are looking for them, people we don't want in this town. We have rules, we have order." "They were with their mother. She's dead," Jedediah said, his voice low and dangerous. "I buried her myself." This gave Brody a moment's pause. He respected the finality of death, but his suspicion quickly returned. "And the father, nowhere to be seen." "Convenient," Brody muttered. He pointed a thick finger at the twins. "I don't like it, Jed. They're a problem. We don't have an orphanage. The closest one is in Denver, and that's a week's ride. They can't stay here." "They're staying with me," Jedediah declared. The words left his mouth before he'd even fully formed the thought. The decision was made. Brody laughed, a short, humorless bark. "With you, you're living in a rented room at the smithy, sleeping on a cot. You can barely take care of yourself." The truth of the words stung, but Jedediah didn't flinch. "I'll manage. I'm giving you 1 week, Jed," the sheriff said, his voice hardening into an official decree. 1 week to find out who they are and where they belong. If you can't, I'll have them put on the next stagecoach to Denver, and they'll become the state's problem. Is that clear? Jedediah stared back, his jaw tight. Clear. After Brody left, a tense silence filled the room. Elias sighed, cleaning his spectacles. He's a fool, but he's a predictable fool. His fear is of the unknown, and right now, these children are the greatest unknown this town has ever seen. Jedediah looked at the twins who had watched the confrontation with wide, intelligent eyes. Pima had finished her tea and was now tracing the patterns on the cup with her finger. Norbu was polishing his small wooden bird on the sleeve of his coat. I need a place, Jedediah said, more to himself than to Elias. A real place. His mind went to the homestead, to Sarah's rocking chair, the empty cradle. He had run from it, but now it was the only thing he could think of. It was a home. It had 4 walls and a roof. It had a well with clean water. I'm buying it back, he said. Elias looked at him, a new respect in his eyes. Caleb Johnson bought it. He was planning to farm the lower pasture. He's a reasonable man. He might sell. That night, Jedediah didn't take the children to his cramped room at the back of the blacksmith's forge. He took them to the boarding house, Mrs. Gable looked at him, then at the twins, her face a storm of disapproval. I'll pay double, Jedediah said, slapping coins on her counter before she could speak. Money was an argument she understood. She gave them a small room in the back, muttering about fleas and strange diseases. Inside, Jedediah lit a lamp. He had bought 2 small blankets and a loaf of bread from the general store. He laid the blankets out on the floor as he suspected they were not used to beds. The twins huddled together, watching his every move. He broke the bread, offering a piece to each of them. They took it, their movements still cautious, but the terror was slowly being replaced by a watchful curiosity. As he sat on the edge of the cot, watching them eat, Pema did something unexpected. She finished her bread, stood up, and walked over to him. She held out her empty hands, palms up, and then bowed her head slightly. It was a gesture of thanks, formal and elegant. Norbu watched, and after a moment he did the same, though he kept one hand protectively over the pocket where he'd tucked his bird. A crack appeared in the granite of Jedediah Stone's defenses. For the first time in 6 months, he felt something other than the crushing weight of grief or the dull ache of survival. It was a fragile, unfamiliar warmth. He had a week to solve an impossible mystery, to stand against a hostile town, and to protect 2 children who had somehow, against all odds, started to feel like his. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but for the first time, he found he was strong enough to bear it. The next few days settled into a strange, challenging routine. Jedediah, true to his word, sought out Caleb Johnson. Johnson was a pragmatic farmer who had been more interested in the homestead's pasture land than the house itself. Seeing the desperate resolve in Jedediah's eyes, and with a significant premium added to the price he'd paid, he agreed to sell the property back. The transaction left Jedediah with little more than a handful of coins to his name, but as he held the deed in his hand, he felt a sense of ownership he hadn't realized he'd missed. Moving back into the house was like walking into his own tomb. Every object screamed of Sarah. Her scent, faint and floral, still clung to the curtains. He immediately took down the rocking chair and the cradle, storing them in the barn, the act a painful surgery on his own heart. But he had no time to dwell. He had 2 small, silent shadows who followed him everywhere. Life with Norbu and Pema was a pantomime, a slow, frustrating dance of gestures and guesswork. He learned that they ate with a quiet, focused deliberation, never grabbing or hoarding food. He learned they washed their hands and faces meticulously before every meal, a ritual he found himself adopting. He learned that Pema was the explorer, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table, her eyes full of questions he couldn't answer. Norbu was the guardian, always watching, always positioned between his sister and any perceived threat, his hand never far from the small wooden bird. That bird became Jedediah's obsession. It was his only clue. One evening, by the light of the fire, he managed to convey through gestures that he wanted to see it. Norbu was hesitant, his dark eyes filled with suspicion. But Pema, seeing Jedediah's gentle intent, whispered something to her brother in their melodic tongue. Reluctantly, Norbu produced the object. It was not a bird native to the Rockies. It was smaller than his thumb, carved from a dark, dense wood he didn't recognize. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. The feathers were rendered with microscopic precision. The head was cocked in a lifelike pose, and on its underside, so small he almost missed it, was a symbol, a stylized, endless knot. He took it to Doc Vance. Elias polished his spectacles and held the carving up to the light of a lamp, turning it over and over. "Extraordinary," Elias murmured. "This is not whittling, Jed. This is artistry of a high order. The wood, it could be sandalwood, maybe ebony. Not native, that's for certain. And this knot," he sketched the symbol on a piece of paper. "This is a recurring motif in certain Eastern cultures. I've seen variations of it in books on China and India. It often represents eternity, the interconnectedness of all things." "What does that tell us?" Jedediah asked, impatient. It tells us, Elias said, looking up at him, that these are not the children of simple peasants. This carving is a luxury item, a token. It suggests a life of some status, some education, a world away from Redemption Gulch. He sighed. It also tells us that finding where they belong is going to be even harder than we thought. This isn't from the next county over Jed. This is from the other side of the world. The news was a heavy blow. The sheriff's one-week deadline was melting away like an early snow. The town's attitude, fueled by Mrs. Gable's relentless gossip, had curdled from suspicion to outright hostility. Rumors flew that the children were bad omens, that they were gypsies who had cursed their own mother. When Jedediah went to the general store, mothers would pull their own children away from the twins. Men would stop talking and watch him pass, their eyes cold. One afternoon, a rock shattered a window of the homestead. Jedediah rushed outside to see a trio of teenage boys scrambling away, laughing. He stood on his porch, his hands clenched into fists, a cold rage building inside him. He looked back into the house. Pema was sweeping up the broken glass with a small brush, her face calm. Norbu stood beside her, his small body rigid, his eyes burning with a fury that mirrored Jedediah's own. In that moment, the bond between the man and the children solidified. It was them against the world. He needed a breakthrough. Frustrated, he tried to communicate with them again, using the bird as a prompt. He pointed to the bird, then to them, then made a broad questioning gesture at the world outside. Where, he asked, the word useless but filled with his desperation. Pema understood his frustration. She went to the small bundle of their belongings, the only things they had from their former life. She rummaged inside and pulled out a small silk pouch. From it, she took a piece of folded brittle paper. It was a drawing, done in delicate charcoal lines. It depicted a man. He had the same high cheekbones and dark eyes as the twins, but his head was shaved and he was wearing long, flowing robes of a simple design. He was smiling, a gentle, serene expression on his face. In the background were soaring mountains, but they weren't the familiar jagged peaks of the Rockies. They were different, more rounded and dotted with fantastic buildings with swooping tiered roofs. It was a picture of a world Jedediah couldn't possibly imagine. At the bottom of the drawing was a column of strange, beautiful symbols. It was writing. He felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, a name, a place. He just couldn't read it. He took the drawing straight to Doc Vance. Elias stared at it for a long time. "Jed," he said, his voice hushed with excitement, "I believe this is Tibetan script. The architecture in the background. It resembles drawings I've seen of the Patala Palace in Lhasa. And the man, the shaved head, the robes. He's a monk." A monk. The idea was so foreign, so bizarre, that Jedediah couldn't process it. "But the children," Jedediah began. "How can a monk have children?" "That," Elias said, "is a question I cannot answer. Perhaps he wasn't always a monk. Perhaps the rules are different where they come from. But it gives us a direction. There are Tibetan communities, small ones in California. Immigrants who came during the gold rush or to work on the railroad. It's a long shot, a needle in a continent-sized haystack, but it's more than we had yesterday." The hope was fragile, but it was there. That night, Jedediah felt a shift in the house. He was cleaning his Hawken rifle, the familiar ritual a comfort. The children were sitting by the fire. He had started to hum a tuneless, mournful song that Sarah had loved. He didn't even realize he was doing it. Pema looked up. She listened for a moment, then began to hum a different melody, the same funereal chant he had heard on the mountain. It was slow, deeply sad, but beautiful. After a moment, Norbu joined her, his harmony weaving through hers. Jedediah stopped humming, his hands still on his rifle. He closed his eyes and just listened. He was a widower from Montana. They were orphans from a mountain rooftop on the other side of the world. They shared no language, no history, no culture, but in that moment, sitting in the warm glow of the fire, they shared their grief, each humming a song for the one they had lost. And for the first time, Jedediah Stone didn't feel entirely alone in his sorrow. The silence was still there, but now it was a shared silence filled with a quiet, heartbreaking harmony. The sheriff's deadline was tomorrow, and Jedediah had no idea what he was going to do. Thousands of miles away in a small makeshift monastery carved into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, a man named Tenzin stirred from his meditation. The morning sun cast a golden light across the simple room, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. For 2 years, Tenzin had been a monk at the Gampo Ling settlement, a tiny, improbable sanctuary founded by a handful of his countrymen, who had come to America not for gold but for refuge. For Tenzin, the monastery was a refuge from a pain so vast it had swallowed his world whole. His life was a discipline of prayer, chanting, and the quiet rhythm of chores. He sought emptiness, a release from the cycle of suffering, a way to quell the ghosts that haunted his every waking moment and flooded his dreams. The ghosts had names: Dolma, his beloved wife, and Norbu and Pima, his twin children. He had not always been a man of the cloth. In his former life in Kham, an eastern province of Tibet, he had been a royal guard, a man of action and deep loyalties. He was sworn to protect a local prince, a man of reform and wisdom. Dolma was the prince's youngest daughter, a spirit as bright and fierce as a mountain flame. Their union was a happy one, but it was set against a backdrop of political turmoil and violent regional rivalries. When a rival warlord laid siege to their province, Tenzin was tasked with smuggling the prince's family to safety in British India. The escape was a nightmare of snow-blinded mountain passes and narrow, treacherous trails. They were pursued relentlessly. In a desperate move to save his family, Tenzin made a fateful decision. He would act as a decoy. Taking a small contingent of loyal guards, he led their pursuers on a false trail high into the northern peaks, giving Dolma and the children, guided by his most trusted friend, time to escape south. He fought a running battle for 3 weeks, drawing the warlord's forces further and further away. He survived, but when he finally made his way wounded and starving to the agreed-upon rendezvous point in Sikkim, they were not there. He waited for a month. He spent another year searching, following every rumor, every whisper, from the teeming markets of Calcutta to the remote villages of Nepal. He found nothing, not a trace. The conclusion was inescapable and soul-crushing. They had perished. A landslide, a sickness, a simple, tragic fall, the mountains that had been their home had consumed them. His grief was an ocean, and he drowned in it. He renounced his old life, the life of a warrior and a husband, and took the vows of a monk. The path of non-attachment, he prayed, would be the only cure for his shattered heart. He eventually joined a small group sailing to America, seeking a place where the ghosts of his past might not follow so closely. But they had. Every time he saw a child, every time he heard a woman's laughter, the wound would tear open anew. His life of quiet penance was shattered by the arrival of a traveling merchant named Mr. Huan, a Chinese trader who supplied the small community with rice tea and news from the outside world. Huan was a garrulous man who loved to trade in stories as much as goods. As the monks shared tea with him, he spoke of his travels through the mining camps and railroad towns of Nevada and the territories beyond. And in this dusty little scrap of a town called Redemption Gulch, Huan said, I saw the strangest thing. A grizzled trapper, a man who looks like he wrestles bears for a living, had two little ones with him. Chinese, I thought at first, but not quite. They never spoke a word, but their eyes, they watched everything. The boy, he had this little toy, a bird he kept polishing. Tenzin, who had been listening with polite detachment, suddenly went rigid. His teacup rattled in its saucer. A bird, he asked, his voice tight. Yes, a little wooden bird, Huan said, pleased to have the quiet monk's attention. Funny little thing. Looked like a hoopoe, I think. Beautifully carved. The world tilted on its axis for Tenzin. A hoopoe. It was Dolma's favorite bird. On their 5th anniversary, he had spent months carving a perfect tiny replica from a piece of sandalwood he had traded a prize dagger for. It was a unique, one-of-a-kind token of his love. He had given it to Norbu on his last birthday, telling him to guard it as a symbol of their family. His hands began to tremble. This trapper, the children, he stammered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. What did they look like? Mr. Huan, seeing the profound change in the monk's demeanor, described them as best he could. A boy and a girl. Twins, dark eyes, black hair, 5 or 6 years old. Every word was a hammer blow to Tenzin's heart, shattering the walls he had built around his grief. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A madness born of hope. And yet, after Mr. Huan left, Tenzin went straight to the abbot, a wise elderly monk named Lama Kama. He recounted the story, his voice cracking, with an emotion he had suppressed for years. He showed the abbot a hidden tattoo on his forearm, the same endless knot he had carved into the bottom of the bird, a symbol of his unbreakable bond with Dolma. Lama Kama listened patiently, his ancient eyes full of compassion. Hope is the most beautiful and the most dangerous of all attachments, the abbot said softly. It can lead to enlightenment or it can lead to madness. If you pursue this, you are turning your back on the path of release you have sought. They are my children, Tenzin said, the words feeling foreign and yet profoundly right on his tongue. If there is a 1 in a million chance they are alive, my vows mean nothing. My path is to them. The abbot saw the truth in his eyes. This was not a choice. It was a calling, a duty that superseded any vow made in grief. The journey is long and dangerous, Lama Kama said. You should not go alone. The world beyond these hills is not kind to our ways. And so it was decided. Tenzin would go, and 3 other monks would accompany him, not as protectors in a warrior's sense, but as witnesses and companions to lend their spiritual strength to his quest. One was a young, strong monk named Choki, who knew some English from working with railroad foremen. Another was an elderly monk, Lobsang, who was skilled in healing arts. The third was a quiet, stoic man named Jinpa. They packed what little they owned, their robes, begging bowls, and some dried provisions. Tenzin took something else. From a locked chest, he retrieved the charcoal drawing he had made of himself in his monk's robes, a gift for his family that he never got to send. On the back, Dolma had drawn a picture of herself and the twins, a happy secret memory. He had kept it as his only memento, a treasure of his pain. Now, it was a map of his hope. 4 Tibetan monks, men of peace, in a land of violence, set out from their mountain sanctuary. They walked their maroon and saffron robes a stark slash of color against the browns and greens of the California landscape. They were heading east into the vast, unknown expanse of the American West. Tenzin did not know what he would find. He didn't know if he was chasing a ghost or a miracle. He only knew that for the first time in years, he was not running from his past. He was walking towards his future. His every step was a prayer, his every breath a mantra. Norbu, Pima, be safe. I am coming. The day of the deadline dawned cold and grey. A nervous tension gripped Redemption Gulch, thick and suffocating as wood smoke on a windless morning. Sheriff Brody was a man on edge. He'd made a promise, an ultimatum, and he intended to keep it. In his mind, it was a simple matter of law and order. The strange children had to go. Jedediah Stone woke before the sun, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He looked at Norbu and Pema, still asleep, huddled together on their floor pallet. In 1 week, they had transformed his empty, silent house into a home, albeit a strange and quiet one. Pima's innate curiosity had led her to organize his mismatched tins of beans and coffee into neat rows. Norbu had taken to following him on his chores, watching him chop wood with an intense, silent focus, as if memorizing the skill. They were small, but they were not broken. They were resilient. They were his. The thought was fierce and absolute. He had no plan. He had the drawing of the monk and the name of a place, Tibet, that was for all practical purposes on the moon. It was nothing he could present to Brody. His only plan was defiance. Around mid-morning it began. Brody, flanked by 2 hastily deputized townsmen, a nervous young store clerk, and a surly ranch hand, marched up the path to the homestead. "It's time, Jed," Brody said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The stage leaves in an hour. Get the children." Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, blocking the doorway. He wasn't holding his rifle, but he stood with the solid, immovable presence of a man who had nothing left to lose. "They're not going anywhere, Brody." "Don't be a fool," the sheriff growled. "This isn't your fight. They're not your kin." "You're wrong," Jedediah said, his voice quiet, but carrying a chilling intensity. "They are now." From behind him, Pima and Norbu appeared in the doorway, their faces pale. They understood the confrontation, if not the words. Norbu moved to stand slightly in front of his sister, a mirror of Jedediah's own protective stance. The standoff was broken by a shout from the edge of town. "Sheriff, Sheriff, you better come see this!" A rider was galloping madly down the main street. Brody, annoyed at the interruption, turned. "What is it now? Riders coming?" the man panted, pulling his horse to a skidding halt. "4 of them, dressed like nothing I ever saw before." A ripple of alarm went through the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered to watch the drama at the homestead. Brody, his face grim, motioned for his deputies. "Stay here. Watch him." He strode off towards the center of town. Jedediah's mind raced. Riders, could it be? A desperate, impossible hope flickered in his chest. From his vantage point on the hill, he saw them first. 4 figures walking, not riding, down the main road into town. They moved with a calm, deliberate pace, their maroon and saffron robes a shocking, vibrant sight against the dusty brown of the street. They were unarmed, carrying only walking staffs and small bundles. The reaction in Redemption Gulch was instantaneous. Fear, raw and primal, swept through the town. These were not cowboys or prospectors, they were aliens. The men, already on edge, grabbed their rifles from their scabbards. Mrs. Gable shrieked and herded children inside. The saloon emptied as men poured into the street, pistols in hand. Sheriff Brody held up a hand, trying to maintain control. "Hold your fire. Let's see what they want." The four monks stopped at the entrance to the main street, faced with a small army of terrified armed townsfolk. Tenzin was at the front. His gaze swept over the hostile faces, the glinting rifle barrels. His heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained a mask of serene calm. Chucky, the young monk who spoke some English, stood beside him, his knuckles white where he gripped his staff. "We come, peace," Chucky called out. His voice strained, the English words heavy and accented. "Peace," Brody scoffed, stepping forward. "You look like you're here for a war. What's your business in my town?" "We look for children," Chucky said. "A boy, a girl, from our land." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Eyes darted from the monks to the homestead on the hill. The connection was made. Brody's face darkened with suspicion. "What do you want with them?" he demanded. "How do we know you're not the ones who abandoned them?" Tenzin whispered something to Chucky in their tongue. Chucky nodded and called out, "Their mother. She died. We'd seek to bring them home." At the homestead, Jedediah felt his blood run cold. It was them. The father. He looked down at Pima and Norbu. Their eyes were fixed on the figures in the street, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, fear, and a dawning, heartbreaking hope. Pima's hand crept into his. Down in the street, the tension was about to snap. The surly ranch hand who Brody had deputized was shaking his rifle, pointed unsteadily at Tenzin. "They're heathens, Sheriff. Look at 'em. Let's run 'em out." "I give the orders here," Brody barked, but he was losing control. Tenzin knew this was the moment. Words were failing. Fear was winning. He whispered again to his companions, then handed his staff and bundle to Choki. He raised his empty hands, showing he was unarmed. And then he began to walk forward alone, directly towards the line of guns. "Stop right there," Brody yelled, drawing his pistol. "One more step and I'll shoot." Tenzin did not stop. His eyes were not on the sheriff or the guns. They were locked on the small homestead on the hill, on the two tiny figures he could just make out on the porch. He began to chant a low, resonant sound that cut through the tense silence. It was not a war cry. It was a prayer, a call. On the porch, Norbu's head snapped up. His eyes went wide. He let go of his sister's hand, and with a cry that was a mixture of his native tongue and pure, unadulterated joy, he shouted, "Apa!" He bolted. He flew down the porch steps and started running, his small legs pumping straight towards the man in the street. "Norbu nu!" Jedediah cried, his heart leaping into his throat. The boy's cry, the foreign word, and his desperate sprint towards the monk shattered the standoff. The townsfolk were momentarily stunned. Brody hesitated, his pistol wavering. Tenzin's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his face as he saw his son, alive and real, running towards him. He dropped to his knees, his arms outstretched. Norbu reached him and leaped into his arms, burying his face in his father's robes, his small body shaking with sobs. Tenzin held him, rocking back and forth, chanting his name. His prayer answered. Pema was right behind him, her own cry of "Apa" echoing her brother's. She joined the embrace, her small arms wrapping around both her father and her brother. The sight of it, the reunion so raw and powerful, disarmed the town. rifles were lowered. The anger and fear on the faces of the townsmen were replaced by confusion, then by a dawning, shame-faced understanding. This was no invader. This was a father who had found his lost children. Jedediah Stone walked slowly down the hill, his legs unsteady. He stopped a few feet away, a spectator to the most sacred moment he had ever witnessed. Doc Vance came and stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Sheriff Brody holstered his pistol, his face pale. He looked from the weeping father to Jedediah, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. He had been wrong, terribly, dangerously wrong. Tenzin looked up from his children, his tear-filled eyes finding Jedediah's. The two men locked gazes over the heads of the children. There was no language between them, but none was needed. In that single silent glance, a universe of shared experience passed between them. The grief of loss, the terror of helplessness, the fierce, indomitable love of a father. Gratitude profound and absolute flowed from the monk to the widower, and in return, a quiet, painful, and deeply necessary sense of release. Jedediah's fight was over. The children were home. In the aftermath of the standoff, a strange, embarrassed quiet fell over Redemption Gulch. The townsfolk, who had been ready to open fire on strangers, now shuffled their feet, unable to look the monks or Jedediah in the eye. It was Doc Vance who broke the spell, stepping forward and offering his clinic as a neutral, welcoming space. The reunion inside was both joyous and sorrowful. With Choki acting as a translator, the fractured pieces of the story finally came together. Tenzin, his voice thick with emotion, explained his life as a royal guard, the flight from his home, and the terrible decision to split up to save his family. He recounted his agonizing search and his subsequent belief that they were all dead, a belief that had led him to renounce the world and take his vows. Then he listened, his face a mask of pain, as Jedediah and Doc Vance pieced together what had happened to his wife. They surmised that Dolma, guided by Tenzin's friend, must have made it to the American coast, probably San Francisco. From there, hearing rumors of a Tibetan sanctuary being formed in the mountains, she had set off on her own desperate journey, only to be caught by the brutal early onset of winter in the Rockies. She was a woman of the Himalayas, but the American wilderness was a different, more unforgiving beast. She had succumbed to exhaustion and exposure, her last act being to tuck her children safely into their makeshift shelter. Tenzin wept openly, mourning his brave wife for a second time, but this time with the certainty of her fate. Norbu and Pima, sensing his grief, clung to him, their own silent tears wetting the front of his robes. That evening, a historic event occurred in Redemption Gulch. Jedediah Stone hosted 4 Tibetan monks for dinner at his homestead. The town watched in silent awe. Jedediah, a man who had isolated himself in grief, now found his small house filled with the low hum of chanting and a language he didn't know. He shared his meager provisions, stew bread, coffee, and the monks in return shared their own roasted barley flour tsampa, which they mixed with tea. Through Choki, Tenzin formally expressed his gratitude. He says, Choki translated, that you are a man of great compassion. He says that in our tradition, a man who saves a life saves a world. You have saved 2 worlds for him. He will be in your debt for all of his remaining days. Jedediah, uncomfortable with the praise, just shook his head. I did what anyone ought to have done. No, Choki corrected gently. The sheriff, the town, they would not have. Tenzin La sees your heart. He says it carries a great sadness like his own. He sees the ghost of your own child in your eyes when you look at his. Jedediah flinched the words, striking a nerve he thought was numb. He looked at Tenzin, and the monk met his gaze, bowing his head slightly, in a gesture of shared sorrow and profound respect. The barrier of language and culture evaporated, leaving only the raw, universal truth of their shared experience as grieving fathers. The monks stayed for a week, camping in a small grove of aspen trees near the homestead. It was a time of healing and decision. The town, led by a deeply humbled Sheriff Brody and a remorseful Mrs. Gable, offered gifts of food and blankets, their own silent apology for their fear and prejudice. The biggest question remained, what would Tenzin do? His children were alive, but he was a monk, bound by vows of non-attachment. Could he simply return to his monastery with them? Could he raise them in that cloistered environment? The answer came during a quiet conversation between Tenzin and Jedediah, with Doc Vance helping to translate the more complex ideas. "My path has changed," Tenzin said, looking at Norbu and Pima as they chased butterflies in the meadow. "I took my vows in the shadow of their death. To live in the light of their lives, I must be their father first. My monastery is my heart, and they are its only residents now." He explained his decision. He would not return to the monastery in California, nor would he attempt the impossible journey back to Tibet. His home was with his children. He and his companions would find a place nearby, a small plot of land, where they could build a new, tiny settlement, a place of peace, a new Gampo Ling. And so another unlikely transaction took place. Jedediah Stone, the man who had bought his homestead, back out of desperation, sold the lower pasture, the very land Caleb Johnson had wanted, to Tenzin. He sold it for the price of one small, intricately carved wooden bird. The final scene in this chapter of Redemption Gulch's history was not one of departure, but of beginning. Tenzin and the other monks, now landowners, began the work of clearing the land, their rhythmic chanting a new kind of music in the valley. Norbu and Pema divided their time between their father's new camp and Jedediah's homestead. They were slowly, hesitantly learning a few words of English from Jedediah, and he, in turn, was learning to say their names correctly. One evening, Jedediah sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the widow's peak. He was no longer just a widower. His grief was not gone. It was a part of him, an amputation of the soul that would never fully heal. But it was no longer the only thing inside him. His life, once a closed, silent room, now had a window. And through that window shone the light of an unlikely, extraordinary kinship. He saw Tenzin walking with his two children, their silhouettes dark against the twilight sky. He thought of Sarah and Daniel, and for the first time, the memory brought not just a wave of pain, but a quiet, bittersweet warmth. He had lost his family, but in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West, he had found another. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was no longer alone. The story of Jedediah Stone and Tenzin's family isn't just a story about the Old West. It's a testament to the fact that even in the harshest landscapes and in the most wounded hearts, compassion can take root and grow into something powerful. It's a story about how grief can be a bridge, not just a wall, connecting two men from opposite ends of the earth. In a town called Redemption, a widower found his own form of salvation, not by forgetting his past, but by embracing an unexpected future. A community confronted with its own fear was forced to see the humanity in those they deemed other. If this story of an unlikely family forged in tragedy and hope moved you, please give this video a like to help it reach others. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of real-life drama and the enduring power of the human spirit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories and epic dramas from the forgotten corners of the world. Thank you for listening.